just about to start recording. Okay, great. As Jennifer said, my name is Alison Kilgore. I'm the Federal Housing Assets Team Manager. And so today is the third of three in this training series going over Part 5, Income and Assets. That was kind of our entry-level class to folks that are new in the field. And so that was recorded back in September of 21, and that's on our website. Then we did an income calculation 201, going over some more of those complicated sources of income that you may see on your properties. And today we're going to be going over assets 201. So some of the more complicated assets that you may see in your certifications or recertifications. As Jennifer mentioned, this is being recorded and will be posted to the website. Generally, that's up within a week or so. If you're going back and having staff or yourself go back to review or watch any of these pre-recorded trainings, and you want to have a copy of the handouts that we either reference during the trainings or the actual slides themselves, just shoot us an email, and we will also share these slides out today after the training as well. All right. So listed here are the regulations and requirements that guide how we at DOH treat these sources of assets. And so the regulations are here, and as always, it's important to know what layer or layers are applicable at your various properties to know which regulations you need to follow. And you'll note on here, we don't mention anything specifically about our state funds. So if you have HDG funds at your property, we ask that you refer to your use covenant, and we also have home as our safe harbor. So many of the regulations that we're referencing for home with regards to how assets are treated will apply to those state funds as well. Okay. And so jumping into the definition of assets before we launch into a few of the more complicated items. So when we talk about assets at any of our projects or programs, we are referencing checking, savings, those peer-to-peer bank accounts like Venmo or PayPal, of course, actual cash under the mattress, revocable trusts, equity in rental property or other capital investments, stocks, bonds, CDs, things like retirement accounts, if the family member or your applicant has access to them, even if there's a penalty to withdraw. Similarly, retirement accounts, if somebody has access to those funds without being required to retire or terminate their employment. Assets include whole or universal life insurance policies, real estate and personal property held as an investment. So, this gets to the bottom because it's pretty rare, but folks who have, like coins and as an investment or gems, things like that, or assets held in foreign countries. So if somebody has a piece of property, in another country or a home in another country, that is still considered an asset for your determination. And assets do not include personal property. So that's, their car, their personal jewelry, things like that. Interests in Indian trust land, term life insurance. So those are policies that are only paid out at death. Equity in a co-op unit in which the family lives. Assets that are part of an active business, those accounts that they can't access while employed. Assets not effectively owned by the applicant, or those such as an irrevocable or non-revocable trust, or those that are not accessible. Sometimes we see this if there's a case of domestic violence and they may own a house with their spouse, but because of the domestic violence, they receive no income from it and they could not convert the asset to cash. So that's sometimes we see folks are fleeing a DV situation, and they may co-own a home. We wouldn't see it on the tick all the time because they, don't have access to it because of their circumstances. So, in those situations, we would just want to see, the file documented to be clear of why it's excluded. Right. Always helpful to mention again for verifications of assets at the initial qualification for any DOH assisted unit. You must verify those assets with source documents. And for the home program, if you have a home assisted unit, that income verification is valid for 6 months. So that's kind of a unique time frame out of all of the different programs. And the other sources, so HTF or HDG, and then your tax credit program is, those income verifications and asset verifications are valid for 120 days from the date of receipt. There are some additional nuances for the timing of those verifications for homebuyer programs. So if you are operating a homebuyer program, the date of commitment is a little bit different based on if the person is purchasing existing housing or housing to be constructed. And so your asset manager here can help walk you through that if you're not familiar on how to determine if something is current enough. And also a friendly reminder that all verifications must be complete by the effective date. So you've gotten your third party back, obtained any clarification you need, and you've got your file all organized before that person actually has the effective date to move in, or the funds are committed for homeownership. Right. So types of assets that we covered in the first training. We already covered checking, savings, those more traditional direct express cards, cash, and how to calculate imputed versus actual asset income. So we won't be touching on that again today. So if you do still have questions on those, feel free to go back and re-review the previously recorded webinars. And so today we're going to be covering real estate, annuities, trusts, retirement accounts, investment accounts, and everybody's least favorite, assets disposed of for less than fair market value. So this is going to be the format for each of our types of asset that we'll go over today. So some of it may feel a little bit redundant, but we're going to just try to use the same format for all of these sources. So for real estate, that includes any sort of real properties, so land, vacant land, homes or apartments. And in order to document the cash value of this, for you to do your certification or your research, you'll need to collect information about how to determine the market value. So that may be an appraisal, things like that. You'll also, if the person owes still on the home, you'll need to collect information on the mortgage that may be outstanding, as well as an estimate of the expenses of selling. And if you have somebody that is coming to you and they don't have an estimate on the expense of selling, the HUD handbook uses an 8%. I've also seen a 10% be used, but just to be consistent across the board when you're calculating this at your particular properties or within your organization. And so that's how you'll be able to collect the cash value of it. So you would just back out from the market value, any amount that they owe on the mortgage, if that applicable, and back out the expense of selling to get your cash value. Things that can be tricky about a household that's coming in with real estate, just gathering the information can take a lot of time and energy to have the applicant gather that, especially if they're really eager to move into your property. It can also be tricky if somebody is leaving their home to move into your property, of asking those probing questions of what's the plan for this piece of property or this home after you move into our unit. Are you going to rent it out? In which case that would be projected annual income, which may affect their eligibility, or if they intend to sell it. Making sure that to ask those probing questions when they come into research to see if they did sell it, did they sell it or give it away to family, things like that. So just kind of taking a few minutes to really evaluate how this piece of property or home is going to act in the file. And so when DOH is coming to do our monitorings, either our contract monitorings or long-term monitorings, we're going to be looking in the file to make sure that your application and your income and asset questionnaire are asking about if the person owns real estate, and if they do, that the file is clearly documented. How was the market value calculated? Was there a mortgage on the property that they owe for it? And was the expense of selling included in calculating that cash value of the asset? Yeah, and a great question has come up. Would manufactured homes be considered real estate assets? So yes, though in those cases, the person may not own the land. They may just own, the unit itself. So we'd want to know similarly to that of, what is the plan for this when they move into your property? Will they be renting it out? Do they anticipate to sell it? Will they be giving it away to a friend or family member or somebody that may be remaining in the unit? So you'll be asking kind of those similar questions, though, there wouldn't be a mortgage on it. It would be a different type of loan. So the calculation may be a little bit different. But yeah, you would definitely look at that. And we've seen that in some files that we've monitored across the state. We have another question about how to calculate the market value if there's not an appraisal on the property. Those can be expensive. And so a question is, could we use comps from the neighborhood? Things like Zillow, that certainly is less exact than an appraisal. But if you don't have that or you are unable to get that, then I have seen Zillow or Zillow-like estimates of the home value be used in that calculation, though I, in general, have seen those be kind of a little bit on the higher side than an actual appraisal. Okay. All right, Jennifer, were there any other real estate questions?
You got them all. Thank you.
Great. All right. So happy to jump back to any of the prior sources if something comes up that you may have or may think of later on. But we'll go now to annuities. And so for those of you who took the Income 201 class, we talked also about how real estate and annuities could act as a source of income or as an asset. So when you see these in your tenant files or applicant files, just taking a pause at the beginning and think about, how is this asset acting? Is it acting just as an asset, or is it generating income like a rental or fixed payments? In which case it would kind of live in your income section of your certification. So today we're talking about annuities. We're just going to be talking about annuities that are acting just as an asset, meaning not generating regular recurring income. So annuities are contracts sold by insurance companies to provide payments at specified intervals. And so you'll want to understand kind of the terms of these annuities. And again, how is it acting? Is the person reached an age at which they are able to, pull funds in from their annuities? So these fixed annuities guarantee a certain payment amount, and variable annuities act a little bit different, but have a potential for greater returns. So you may, in your files, see, one household have a different type and they act a little bit differently depending on, how it was set up. For annuities, as with most things, it's best and easiest if you're able to get a third-party verification form from the institution, which can spell out, if it's a deferred annuity or what kind it is, the life annuity. And so you'll get that information. It'll help you determine if the asset is generating income through those fixed payments, in which case it's going to live in your income section of your certification. And you'll be able to ask the verification source whether the holder has the right to withdraw the balance of it. And if there's no right of withdrawal, just document the file with that information, and you would omit it from your certification. So that's why definitely getting the third-party verification in lieu of statements is much easier for this type of asset. So what's tricky about these? They can be really different. Each statement looks a little bit different. So getting it from straight from the financial institution is definitely much easier. And when DOH comes to do our monitoring, we're going to be looking at all of those things. Is there income coming in? In which case, are you also treating it as an asset and maybe double counting it? So we're just looking to make sure that that was treated correctly. So part 5 in the HUD handbook, which is one of the handouts that we can send out after today's training, does have a lot of additional details on how to treat an annuity as an asset. So as an example here, we have an applicant reports holding an annuity from which they will not receive payment for another 10 years until they turn 65. So you go back and forth with the insurance agent, and they send you the information back that says it's a fixed annuity with a current value of $20,400, and it's earning an interest rate of 4.5%. So in this particular situation, the applicant could withdraw the current balance, but would pay a surrender penalty of $3,000. And then if the annuity is withdrawn, they would also have a tax penalty. So in this particular scenario, if we wanted to calculate the cash value to go on your certification, you would take that current value, back out the surrender fee and tax penalties to get the cash value for your cert. And of course, this is more than $5,000. So you would compare, the passbook rate, which is 0.06%, against the interest that's actually being earned, which is much higher. But generally, your property management softwares are going to do that math for you. But also always good to remember that if you've got these higher balance assets, that you'll need to be comparing the actual interest earned versus the passbook rate. All right. Next, we'll move on to trusts. So trusts are a legal arrangement generally regulated by state law in which one party transfers property to a second party who holds that for the benefit of one or more third parties. So a lot of folks involved in the creation and management of trusts. These it's nice if you can get a third-party verification form, but oftentimes you're going to need to rely on actual documents. So those can be a little bit complicated to review, so definitely take some time and have a second set of eyes on them when you're reviewing. And so the basis for determining how to treat these relies on the information about who has access to either the principal in the account or the income from the account. So this section of the slide is, pretty similar to the Income 201 training because they oftentimes will act really differently. So you're asking the same probative questions when you're doing your initial review. And so if any member of the household has the rights to withdraw the funds from the account, it's considered an asset and is treated just like any other asset. But if no family member has access to the principal or the income of the trust at the current time, or within your, your first initial certification, or if you're doing a recert within the 12 months to come, then the trust is included in the calculation of income from assets or in the actual income. And if only the income and none of the principal from the trust is currently available to the family member, the income is counted in annual income, but the trust is not included in the calculation of income from assets. So that's a lot of text. They are just very nuanced when you need to look at them and determine who's putting the money in, who can access it, can anybody access it, or is it based on structured payments, or can they not access it till a certain age? So you need to ask a lot of questions when you come upon these. And what's tricky about these, I have historically found it really difficult to get third-party verification, and sometimes people don't know a lot about a trust because they may not be able to access it, or maybe it was set up by somebody else and they haven't had time to really learn more about it. So getting the information for these, I think, is one of the more complicated types of information to gather. And so when DOH comes out to monitor, we're going to make sure that you ask the right questions of the people involved, and was any follow-up or clarification documented in the file so that we can easily that we can easily, figure out how you did your math on it. And you'll see kind of generally 3 types of trusts. You may see a revocable trust, non-revocable, or a special needs trust. And so those all act a little bit differently, and is going to be one of the first questions that you'll want to ask when you encounter these. And we will talk about non-revocable trusts a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. Right. Next, this is one of, probably the more common questions that we get when folks are putting together certifications is with regards to retirement accounts. So these long-term investments have various structures and regulations associated with them. But if you're new, they can be stressful to start trying to work with, because each of them is different and has different rules about what can be accessed. But best thing to do is to try to first get your third-party verification. And if you're unable to collect that, which can be complicated to get the financial institution to sometimes fill out, you would need to rely on statements. And I found that each financial institution on their website, they'll sometimes have kind of a guide on how to read the statements, which can be helpful if you're new to reviewing retirement account statements. And how to calculate this, you'll, of course, first determine if the applicant or tenant has access to those funds without needing to retire or terminate their employment. So if they do not have access without retiring or quitting, then you would need to document the file with your findings. So just put a memo to file of how you gathered that information. You would exclude it from the certification. So that's always the easiest. And if your research on this lands that, yes, this household does have access to the principal, to the amount that's in that retirement account, you would take the current balance and back out the cost to convert to cash. And oftentimes with these retirement accounts, they're quarterly statements, and just thinking that, for many of the types of funding, your verification form is only good for 120 days for most of them, but not all. Making sure you get the most recent quarterly statement, because, quarterly statement could be 90 days old. And if the person isn't going to move in for, 6 weeks, that may be expired at the time that they move in. So keeping an eye on that when you're calculating the cash value for retirement accounts. So you would take that current balance and you'd back out the cost to convert to cash. So this is something that you may be able to determine based on the financial institution's website or by speaking to somebody there. So if there's any early withdrawal penalty, and there's also going to be an IRS penalty to an early withdrawal of these assets, and that would give you your cash value for your certification. So lots to document with retirement accounts, lots to dig into. And so those are the tricky things about it is, communicating with the financial institutions. And also a lot of times people forget about these retirement accounts when you're going over and doing the income and asset questionnaire. So always helpful to look at if the person's employed, looking at their pay stubs, if they're having deductions for retirement accounts, that can help you get that conversation going. And get you to the right place to get all the information, because when DOH comes out to review the files and our monitorings, we'll for sure be looking at pay stubs and those income and asset questionnaires just to see what might be in there if folks had forgotten to include it on the certifications. And just another plug for our Income 201 webinar, if you're looking at retirement accounts of an applicant or tenant, and that retirement account is generating a required minimum distribution, or they're pulling out funds on that with, regular and recurring status, to afford rent and things like that, then that would be treated as income. So always want to make sure that how is this asset acting. All right. Next, we'll jump to investment accounts. So these are a little bit easier to do than retirement accounts or trusts, but investment accounts, generally brokerage accounts, money markets, things like that, that act in practice with regards to calculations, more similar to a savings account than many of the other things we'll talk about today. So for brokerages, money markets, things like that, you'll want to collect that third-party verification. Statements are, if you're not able to get that third-party, statements will be a little bit easier to read than some of the other sources of assets we're talking about today. Generally, there's not a fee to convert these to cash, so you don't need to do much of a calculation for this. I have seen some financial institutions charge a nominal fee, $50, $75 to actually close the account. But I think those have been the outliers. But if you have a solid third-party verification form, it should be asking if there's any cost to convert to cash. And tricky things about this, each statement is different. And sometimes they can be quite long. Maybe it's 10 pages long. And if you're relying on that statement, you do need to collect all pages of the statement for your tenant file, not just the first page with the household's name and the current balance. You'll need each page of it. And so that's one of the things that DOH is looking for, and also looking that we have clear calculations, memos to the file, and that if somebody has several different accounts, it can be really difficult and time consuming for us to come out and monitor if they're all lumped together. So making sure you're listing each account separately on your certification form or your TIC, if that's something that you use at your property. All right. Moving on to assets disposed of for less than fair market value. This is often something that folks have seen on their certification forms or their income and assets questionnaires, and never really put too much thought into it, and maybe would struggle with describing what exactly it is. And because it is pretty uncommon, but it is very important to know what it means and how to explain it to your households that might be applying or conducting the recertification. So this is any asset that's disposed of, so given away or sold, for less than its full value is counted, including cash gifts as well as property and funds put into irrevocable trusts. So to determine the amount that's been given away, you as the property managers or owners must compare that current cash value. So in the examples that we've done prior, we've talked about how to calculate that cash value of the asset to any amount received in compensation. And we'll do a few examples on this because it is kind of a more complicated situation. And this rule applies only when the fair market value of all of the assets given away during the past 2 years exceeds the gross amount received by more than $1,000. So I added that kind of regulation from the HUD handbook just to clarify that you don't need to be worried that one of your tenants is giving their grandson $50 for their birthday. That these are more things of like larger value. So the amount is greater than $1,000 between what they received and what the value was. And what's needed to document, it's highly dependent on what the situation is. So anytime you have an applicant or tenant, check off that box that they have disposed of assets for less than fair market value in the past 2 years, there's going to be a lot of questions that you need to ask them. When did this happen? Who did it go to? What was the value of it? And especially if it's a real estate transaction, there's going to be a lot more documentation than if it's, somebody cashed out a CD and gave it to their grandson. It was, worth $2,000. So tricky things for that, is identifying the presence of this type of asset. I know a lot of times people just kind of go down the income and asset questionnaire when they're filling it out, assuming that things won't apply to them. So sometimes it's a lot of education to your applicants or tenants, making sure that your staff knows how to answer those questions if you're in management. And when DOH comes to look for that, we're going to make sure that there's clear calculations, that question is being asked on your verification forms or whatever you might be using, and that you know the dates of donation or disposal. So our first of two examples for this is going to be an asset disposed of via a non-revocable or irrevocable trust. So in this particular applicant, we have Maggie. She placed $100,000 in a non-revocable trust for her brother Walter on January 1st of 2023, and she's applied to and is in process to move into your property on April 1st in a couple weeks. And so that trust that she put these funds into, it's non-revocable, so she can't pull them out. It's generated $1,000, which was reinvested into the trust. So the way that you would treat this particular situation on Maggie's initial certification would be you would not include any of the income, that $1,000 that was reinvested into the trust, but you would include the value of the asset when it was given away. So that $100,000 would be included as the net family assets for 2 years from the date that that trust was established. So if that trust, in this example, was established on January 1st, it would be 2 years from that day that $100,000 would be an asset disposed of for less than fair market value. So it would appear on Maggie's initial certification on April 1st of this year, and then it would also appear on her recertification on April 1st, 2024. And when you do your 2025 research, 2 years will have elapsed from the date that that asset was disposed of, so it could fall off of your certification. And you wouldn't need to verify anything about it from that date forward. Right. I didn't hear the ding for any questions, so I'm going to go on to the second example. So the second example, we have a real estate situation where we have a homeowner. And so Maria, in this situation, she owned her home when she moved into your property. So say she's a senior and she's downsizing. She wants to move from her home into your senior property on May 1st of last year. And so it's March now. You're preparing her May annual research. And you're doing your interview with her. She's completing the income and asset questionnaire. And on there, she indicates that she has given the home to her younger brother for less than fair market value. So she also sold this home to her brother for a nominal, in this case, fee of $20,000 on February 1st, so just a couple weeks ago. And the home that you've collected from the appraisal and the real estate documents was valued at $200,000. And she'd been living there for a long time. She had no mortgage. She owned it outright. And the broker's fees and settlement costs were $16,000. So we know that this is an asset disposed of for less than fair market value because it was worth $20,000 via the appraisal. And she, sold it to her brother for $20,000. So in order to calculate how much you'll be including on the certification or the TIC, you're going to want to back out from the market value those fees, those costs to convert to cash. And you'd also, in the situation, back out that the amount that the other party paid into it. And that will reduce the amount of the asset disposed of for less than fair market value. So in this scenario, that $164,000 is the value of the asset that was disposed of. And so that will, because she sold this on February 1st, it'll be 2 years from that date that asset will need to still be captured on their certification. So it'll appear on her annual research for May 1st, 2023 and May 1st, 2024. And if you're a property management software, I know that there's a special spot to put this type of asset. And it'll populate just as of that assets disposed of for fair less than fair market value. And then after those 2 years, it'll drop off the certification and you no longer need to really pay any attention to that because it's beyond that required 2-year period. The only difference to this is if, in this scenario, Maria had a mortgage on the property, you would also back that out to calculate, the equity in the home before you back up these other items. But for the sake of space, we said that Maria owned this home outright.
Alison, we got a question in the chat. How would you treat this example if the program has liquid asset limits?
Yeah, and so we can speak to that offline. The DOH project, so if we're investing home into a multifamily apartment, for those, we do not have a liquid asset cap. So if your local municipality or your project has an asset limit, I would refer to those. And I know that there are some different regulations with home ownership for some of our programs. So if you are running programs, speak to your asset manager, because this situation may go against your program guidelines. If that helps answer. If there's anybody else from DOH that wants to chime in about how that applies to programs, please do feel free to do that. Right. So
sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, Alison. A little late unmuting myself, but just wanted to kind of liquid assets, and speaking to that, I would just say please reference our RLF program guidelines, because they get pretty into detail on how you should treat those. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to your asset manager.
Great. Yeah, so just to recap, if you're new to these more complicated sources of assets, when you're doing it, just take a moment to pause before you jump to any conclusions. Make sure that you know exactly, what the assets are for all household members. So for part 5, it's assets of the head of household, spouse, co-heads, everybody in that household you're going to verify assets for. Making sure you're showing the math so that when we come to monitor, we can get into the file and out of the file as fast as possible. Making sure that if you have your calculations, you've got them organized on a clarification sheet. And it can be tricky. COVID had a lot of different things. Some people were cashing out assets, so you may have in the past had assets showing up and they have since been closed. So giving those all a good once over now that everybody is doing full certifications again as required by particular programs. All right. There's some resources here that you'll have the link to them in the handouts if those are sent out after today's training. And that's it. I don't see any other questions in our chat, so I'll hand it back to Jennifer.
Awesome. Thank you, Alison. I don't see any questions in the chat, but folks, if you have some questions or comments marinating, feel free to put them in as I make my last few plugs. We have an April 12th webinar coming up, and that will be how to properly float Division of Housing's assistance. Like Alison mentioned, this webinar will be on our website, and we'll send out the handouts with that. And I think that is all we have for today. Thank you so much to Alison for your presentation. Thank you to everyone who hopped on the webinar today. We appreciate your time, and we hope you have a nice day. Thank you so much.